Next up, we're going to have Matt Segall. He's going to be talking about psychedelics and the extended mind thesis, the ecology of consciousness. Matt is a doctoral student here in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program. And he's also working here at CIIS now. He's wearing many hats and has been both Matt and Chad actually have been incredibly pivotal members in organizing a camp at Burning Man called Cosmocopia, which many of us in this room have had the opportunity to experience together, where we offer astrology and healing arts to the Burning Man community. So they wear lots of hats and do lots of things. Let's see, Matt's undergraduate work was in cognitive science at the University of Central Florida, and he's the author of several articles, and the one he asked me to highlight that he thinks you might all be interested in is Participatory Psychedelia, Transpersonal Theory, Religious Studies, and Chemically Altered, aka Alchemical Consciousness. And that was published in the Journal of Transpersonal Research in 2014. And I highly recommend that you check out his blog, footnotestoplato.com. Without further ado, here's our wizard, Mercury.
Thanks, Natalie. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. I know Chad asked, but I was sitting over there, so I didn't really get to see who was at the last PCC ERIE event in September. Anyone? Wow, almost nobody. Good thing I'm not trying to build on that talk. So yeah, tonight I am going to talk about psychedelics and the extended mind thesis, and I'm doing so in an attempt to articulate the way in which consciousness, human consciousness, can be ecologized. We're in an ecological crisis. It's forcing us to reimagine the way that we inhabit the earth, to reimagine the way we think of ourselves, and I think psychedelics have a very important role to play in that process of reimagination. I'm also going to try to build a little bit on what Chad was saying and offer a sort of a way into the archetypal astrological perspective that is rooted in cognitive science, and a particular paradigm that has emerged in the last 20 years or so in cognitive science. Because I think for the modern mind and even the postmodern mind, it's difficult to grok how such a relationship could be possible. We don't have a mechanism that could explain it. As Rick Tarnas often says, it's considered the gold standard of superstition in our culture. So I'm going to try to provide a different angle of approach that might make sense of how such a relationship between the human psyche and our wider interplanetary ecology, if you will, how that might be possible. So I'm going to be building on the work of two thinkers. This is Richard Doyle. Some of you may have heard of his book that was recently published called Darwin's Pharmacy, Sex, Plants, and the Evolution of the Noosphere. He is basically building on Terence McKenna's idea that human beings have been in a symbiotic, co-evolutionary relationship with psychedelics for hundreds of thousands of years, if not the hominid species for millions of years. I'm also going to be building on Andy Clark's work. He's a cognitive scientist who has developed what he calls the extended mind thesis. And I'm going to start with Clark's ideas and then connect them to Richard Doyle. So this idea of the extended mind thesis is basically that standard cognitive science was trying to understand how human beings think, how the mind works, by looking inside the head, by looking at neural activity and trying to understand the brain by analogy to a computer system where all of the processing is going on inside of our heads. And the idea is that a cognitive system is trying to create an internal representation or model of an external world. And a whole research program in artificial intelligence was spawned out of this way of thinking of what the mind is. They tried to make computers that were fast enough to mimic human behavior and human cognition, and they basically failed because it turns out that it would take an enormous amount of computational power to actually represent the world inside of a computer system. And it turns out, with further research on how human beings actually get around in the world and think about things, that there's way more of an element of embodiment and skillful adaptation to environments, and indeed human cognition relies, as Andy Clark argues, on artifacts and technologies in our environment in order to augment its own processes. So for example, when we think about doing long division and we have a pen and paper, we can divide any number by any other number if you give us a few minutes. Whereas if we didn't have a pen and paper, we wouldn't be able to accomplish that task. Andy Clark likes to focus on various new technologies that are emerging in the last decade or so, smartphones, for example. I don't know about you, but I don't really remember any phone numbers anymore. My phone does that for me. I don't remember my calendar. My phone does that for me. All of these cognitive tasks that we used to have to carry internally are now carried for us in these external memory devices, right? Another great example that I'll tie into Chad's talk, where he was showing us that mandala of the evolution of the human species, is that you could track each of those major shifts in human consciousness by tying them to the forms of technology, and in particular media technologies that were being used by each of these peoples. So in the primal culture, you're dealing primarily with societies that have just discovered speech and song and drum. So it's an oral culture, right? When you move into the archaic, with thinking of like Egypt and the pharaohs and those very hierarchical societies, you've got for the first time the emergence of script, hieroglyphics, character-based languages, where there's still kind of a relationship between the symbols that are used and written down and what they mean in the world and what they're referring to in the world. With the axial age, you get the first alphabets. So now there's a greater separation and abstraction from the thing that the word is supposed to refer to and the word itself. So there's really no direct relationship between a word in an alphabetic language and the thing that it represents. There's no direct relationship between the sound and the meaning. So it's this further degree of abstraction which increases our sense of alienation from nature. Maybe some of you have heard of David Abram. He wrote this book, Spell of the Sensuous. He really goes into how the alphabet as a media technology changed our consciousness. It gave us new capacities as well. For example, the idea of history was born. We could actually write down things and understand linear time as a sequence of events and so on. But we also lost a sense of intimacy and connection with the living, breathing, animate, natural world around us. And then in the modern period, the big media technology, of course, was print, the printing press. This led to an increased sense of individuality. People could sit alone in their rooms by candlelight and read political pamphlets and so on, and it spurred revolutions across the world. It really empowered individual autonomy and so on. And allowed ideas to spread more quickly than they ever had before. You didn't have to have monks transcribing by hand every book that came into their possession. You could just have a machine print copies really quickly and distribute that widely. And then in the postmodern era, at the bottom of Chad's mandala, of course we have electronic media, at first radio and then television, which again drastically transformed consciousness. If you didn't have radio, you wouldn't have had fascism. You wouldn't have had a demagogue being able to talk simultaneously to an entire nation and mesmerize them into committing heinous acts. Similarly, if you didn't have television during the Vietnam era, there wouldn't have been images of war beaming back to people who aren't on the front lines and seeing the carnage and the destruction and the horror of it, and there wouldn't have been a protest movement. to the extent that there was in this country and around the world. And now I think, we're still largely in this postmodern period, but we have a new media technology now, right? The internet. How is that changing consciousness? It's very difficult to tell at the moment. Obviously, major changes are afoot. Anyone who's a local in this neighborhood knows major changes are afoot. But it's too early to tell exactly what's going to happen. Maybe the internet is the media technology that will support an integral consciousness. We'll have to wait and see. But the point here is that these technologies that human beings have been co-evolving with for tens of thousands of years have been giving us new cognitive capacities, and they've been altering our consciousness. So it's not just our brain that makes us conscious. Consciousness is not just inside the head. Consciousness has always been something that is rooted, that the cognitive circuits that we use to think about the world have always been leaving the head, looping through these various technologies that we've been using, and then coming back to then alter the brain. Now, what's interesting about the other thinker, well, let me just give you an example of how Andy Clark thinks about this. He says, we seem to be entering an age in which cognitive prosthetics are displaying a kind of Cambrian explosion of new and potent forms. As the forms proliferate and some become more entrenched, we might do well to pause and reflect on their nature and status. At the very least, minds like ours are the products not of neural processing alone, but of the complex and iterated interplay between brains, bodies, and the many designer environments in which we increasingly live and work. That's from a New York Times op-ed that he wrote in 2010 called Out of Our Brains. So Clark tends to focus on technology and the way that technology extends the mind. And in all that I've read him talk about, he's so mesmerized, as many of us are, understandably so, by this proliferation, this Cambrian explosion of new and potent forms of technology, that he forgets the more primary form of mind extension, the ecological mind extension, the way that human beings have been, as McKenna pointed out, co-evolving with various plants and fungi, and that these symbiotic relationships were in fact largely, McKenna and Richard Doyle argues, are largely responsible for our humanness, for our ability to speak and think in a symbolic way. This is just an example of our society today, how mesmerized we are by technology, and the point I'm making here, to not dismiss what Clark is saying, because obviously technology, whether it's the first written languages or the printing press or iPhones, of course, they're drastically altering our consciousness, and we need to be very aware of that. But this background's the more primary form of relationship that human beings have had to their environments. The more ancient form of relationship that we have had to many psychedelic plants and fungi in our environment. So Richard Doyle also has his own kind of extended mind theory, but he's focusing again on these ecological relationships. So he writes, consciousness is a non-linear and highly distributed system, not ownable by a self and navigable only through its practiced but always irreducible dissolution, the sometimes shattering detachment from distinctness before which a sense of interior and exterior dissolves in awareness and awe. This awareness of interconnection occurs in and with what Vladimir Vernadsky, a Russian scientist, dubbed the noosphere, the aware and conscious layer of the Earth's ecosystem, and perhaps feeds back onto our ecosystems as we become conscious of our interconnections with them. And this is from his book, Darwin's Pharmacy. So, in some sense, we could think of psychedelics as, to use Andy Clark's term, a form of cognitive prosthetic that extend our mind further than we're normally able to extend our consciousness. But on the other hand, a prosthetic implies that we sort of haven't always already been in relationship with these plants and fungi, that we have it, that the very structure of our brain and our neurochemical regime as it exists today is largely a product of this coevolution with these plants and other organisms. So they're not really prosthetics. They're already part of our bodies. The idea that consciousness is an emergent product of neural activity is popular these days. But what I'm suggesting is that consciousness is actually an emergent product of an entire ecosystem. So obviously it's non-locally distributed, but not just in the head. It's not just, that some cognitive scientists will talk about memories being non-locally and holographically distributed around the brain. But I'm saying no, it's even further than the brain, and that the skin barrier is kind of arbitrary. So Doyle again, he says psychedelics as a technology are essentially ecodelic. So ERIE obviously likes the word entheogens, doesn't have the same baggage as psychedelics, coming out of the 60s and the counterculture and all of that. Doyle coins this term ecodelic because for him, these essentially ecodelic technologies, they allow us to leave the world of reference, whereby the narrating I can maintain any reliable differentiation from its object of knowledge. That should be or love. He continues, hailed by the whole, one can become healed through ecodelic practice precisely because the subject turns back on who they thought they were, becoming aware of the existence of a whole, a system in which everything really is connected, the noosphere. Such a vision can be discouraging and even frightening to the phantasmically self-birthed ego, who feels not guilt, but a horror of exocentricity, which is another way of talking about the extended mind thesis. It appears impossible to many of us that anything hierarchically distinct and larger and more complex than Homo sapiens, such as Gaia, could exist. And so we often cry out as one in the wilderness, in amazement and repetition. So when I talk about consciousness being an emergent product of an ecosystem, I mean the planetary ecosystem. The primary consciousness of planet Earth is Gaia. Human consciousness is derivative of that larger consciousness. So it's not just the fact that human beings have been co-evolving with psychedelics that sort of lends weight to this extended mind thesis. It's not just the fact that various plants and fungi in our environment are generating neurotransmitters that are nearly identical to those that are endogenous to our own brain. That's a striking fact. That's enough evidence, I think, that consciousness is ecological in its extent. But to add to that, when you take psychedelics, what happens, right? Your sense of ego consciousness, your sense of being a skin-encapsulated ego, to use Alan Watts's phrase, breaks down, and you begin to recognize the often frightening extent of your interconnection with everything around you. And in some sense, I think that our ecological crisis is severe enough, and our denial of the extent to which our lifestyle will need to change in order to deal with it is so extreme that we need a sort of chemical intervention, and psychedelics can provide that for us. It's not going to be easy. It's not a simple cure-all, but it can begin to make us aware of what we've been unconscious of and what we've been repressing. So part of what, as Chad was talking about, we need to overcome is this, and that we largely were forced to overcome as a result of the Copernican revolution, is the sense of centrality of our species. The sense that, human beings are not just animals, right? We're just one rung of the ladder below angels, and we're special. We're not like all the other creatures on this earth. We're from heaven, and we just ended up here as some kind of a test. I don't know. That mentality is the deep archetypal structure or worldview that has led us into this crisis of mass extinction, climate change, etc. So we need, in order to move past this, it's not just about taking psychedelics. It's about taking psychedelics in a ritual context, a spiritual container that will allow us to interpret these experiences in a way that we can reintegrate into a new form of culture. Many of us, myself included, we're suspicious of institutions and institutionalized religion, of course, but that's how cultures endure. They endure by forming institutions. And CIIS, ERIE, etc., we're trying to create new forms of institutions that can allow this type of consciousness to enter into a cultural container and be preserved and honed and shared. Without institutionalization, you can't do that. So that's our challenge, I think. So this is Ernst Junger. Is that how you pronounce that? I don't know. Richard Doyle quotes him in his book Darwin's Pharmacy. He says, if we recognize the plant, or any non-human organism, I would say, as an autonomous power which enters in order to put roots and flowers in us, then we distance ourselves by several degrees from the skewed perspective which imagines that spirit, or Geist in German, or mind, or consciousness, is the monopoly of human beings and doesn't exist outside of them. A new world picture has to follow the planetary leveling. That is the task which the next century will take up. So, I've coined this word anthrodecentrism. In other words, instead of anthropocentrism, anthrodecentrism, we're in a period where we're trying to foreground what has been backgrounded, namely the community of life on Earth, the wider cosmos. And to do that, the human being needs to take a step back, needs to recognize their non-centrality. Now, on the other hand, obviously, human beings are a very unique animal species. We have taken over the planet, and if we were to disappear tomorrow, it might actually, because of the nature of nonlinear systems, it might actually be more detrimental to the planetary ecosystem than if we didn't just disappear. Because there are all these feedback loops that we've been contributing to, and to remove us, we're such a planetary force now, that would wreak havoc as well. So we're here, we're totally interwoven with the ecosystem now. There is no non-human nature, really, anymore. Everything now is part of, within human reach. We're in a technosphere to a large extent, and there's no turning back from that. We can be regretful about it, but in some sense, we need to take responsibility and recognize our power, but at the same time be humble and become more sensitive to the other forms of intelligence that are operating all around us. So the next step here, which may be a bit of a leap for some of you, is to say that, if you accept that consciousness is ecological in its extent, that because of this coevolutionary symbiotic relationship between human beings and these neurochemical producing plants, that what we think of as the human mind is in fact extended beyond the human skull. If you accept that, then perhaps you'll be willing to entertain the idea that the ecological extension of human consciousness reaches beyond just the surface of the planet and in fact includes the entirety of our solar system. And that there are, if Gaia, if planet Earth is itself a conscious being, or a god or a goddess, as ancient cultures would refer to it, then perhaps other planets are as well. that's the theory, at least, that I'm proposing. And I encourage everyone to ask questions and engage us in our polylog, which will begin momentarily. So thanks for hanging out and entertaining these ideas.